Hi, everybody. This is Clay Charnick here at University of Hawaii. Just in case people are wondering, you're in the right place. We're going to go over a review of the 2017 wildfire events in Hawaii. This is something that is pretty common on the mainland, but we haven't really done a sort of annual review here before, and so we thought it was a good idea to try to do it. And we'll be talking about sort of the larger and not so large fires, but some of the ones that kind of jumped out at us and sort of relative to prior years as well, and just kind of give a run through, and then encourage folks to who want to share their experiences to chime in. So just as a kind of an overview to begin with here. Of course, the Pacific Fire Exchange is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, which is research supporting sound decisions, and they're part of this National Fire Science Exchange Network. I will say that they've been really proactive in funding this kind of information. So in addition to the fire research they fund, they've prioritized funding this exchange program. So trying to get the word out and get science that put in action and ensure science meets the needs of managers. I will also say that the funding situation kind of with the new budget is not looking that promising for us. So, but we're hoping that we'll get some support moving forward, so when the things kind of get pushed through Congress, that this kind of work can continue. The founding partners of the Pacific Fire Exchange include the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, the Institute for Pacific Island Forestry with the U.S. Forest Service, and a cooperative extension program at University of Hawaii at Manoa. We also have partnerships and people that sit on our steering committee from county fire departments, Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and Hawaii State, Guam Forestry, National Park Service. So we kind of draw on quite a wide array of folks for guidance on what we do. And really the goal here is reducing wildfire threats to ecosystems and communities in the Pacific, and doing that by facilitating knowledge exchange, collaborations, and trying to get the best available research to the problems on the ground. And there's a list of some of the examples of products and activities that kind of what we do for that. And so we'll also just like to remind folks that there'll be a feedback survey that kind of gets sent out automatically, bounced to you at the end of the webinar. So just help us, it helps us sort of understand if we're meeting needs and how we can do things better. So please take a minute. It's pretty short to fill that out if you have time. And so this was the idea for this annual review. Wildfires really came models, looking at models elsewhere in the states, other places. Melissa, I think that's you. Can I mute you?
Yes, I'll be quiet shortly. And I'm sorry to jump in really fast. I just want to let everyone know we are recording this, and we're going to unmute you shortly. So keep that in mind as you chime in. Okay, you can mute me if you want, Clay.
Okay, thanks. That's all right. So the idea came from these other efforts to do this on the mainland, and the idea will to be review some of these, quote unquote, significant wildfire events. And what we can look at sort of the capacity kind of from the armchair ecology perspective is looking at these climate and weather factors that were associated with each of these fires, and then looking at the vegetation types or fuel types that were burned. And where the idea for this webinar actually came from was the desire to get feedback, especially from fire responders, but folks that are kind of working in these areas where these fires have occurred, to try to get some sense of lessons learned from the fire response efforts, where there's sort of, for example, mitigation efforts put in place that made response easier, and then other concerns about vulnerabilities of resources that folks are interested in these areas, and then any other ideas or feedback people want to provide. This is all going to kind of get funneled into sort of a written product that'll just kind of go over the patterns and incidents for the past year. So just a really brief review for fire regimes, right? We're just kind of going to be talking about the climate and vegetation components here, but this affects not only sort of fire in the moment when it's happening, and then over the course of a wildfire incident, in terms of weather and fuel types and topography, but we know that sort of broader climate patterns and vegetation types kind of dictate where fires occur over time again and again. And of course, ignitions plays a huge role into that. And in Hawaii, most of our ignition sources are human caused, although we do get lightning strikes as well on occasion. So the ignition part is quite unpredictable. But we can look at patterns and the other factors to understand where and when wildfires happen. And just as kind of a lot of folks have seen this figure, we published this in Pacific Science, but we can look at the long-term fire history for Hawaii, and we can see that there's sort of a concerning pattern sort of over the last several decades of this increase. So this is the total area burned each year going back to the 1904. And so this is up to about 2012. You can see that there's kind of a jump in over the last few decades. And we also have resources that help to try to pull together some of the county and state and federal fire records. So all of this it's supposed to be funneled up to the National Fire Incident Reporting Systems, kind of at the federal level. And so we kind of can get a sense for where things stand for this year versus previous years. And just looking at sort of the 2002 to 2012, over that decade or so, there was an average of 1,000 ignitions per year and an average of 20,000 acres. But you can see the plus or minus 5,000 acres. So there's a kind of a big variability from year to year. And that really is driven by drought conditions and sort of weather. And I'll get into that in a little bit here. And then I just want to give a shout out to Mike Walker from DOFA, who's shared some of these NIFRS data with me. One of the issues we have in Hawaii is trying to compile all the county records along with state records. So for 2016, I actually don't have the county records yet. But for 2017, we were able to look at I think this includes county records, according to Mike, at least, what he was able to find. So 524 fires for 2017, so below average. And then, of course, for the acres burned, we got 7,700 acres about. So also kind of below average that we've seen over the past decade, and much lower than last year. And this is sort of a timeline that Melissa and I kind of worked on together, just to look at when these fires have been happening. And so the interesting thing about Hawaii and a lot of other places as well, I should say, is that it's these few fires that account for most of the area burned on every year. So for example, this year, 92% of that total area burned, that 7,700 acres, was attributed to about 15 fires. And so these were all the fires that are kind of indicated by these blue bars. If you're able to look at the webinar, that those are the acres burned, and then the timeline of months below. And the only one of these sort of, larger fire incidents for Hawaii was this Hyena fire in October. We weren't able to map that just due to cloud cover and vegetation, but we'll get into that as well in a bit. I just want to stop and pause here. If there's anything incident-wise that we're missing, so again, like this was focusing on some of the larger fires, but we're sort of using this word significant to kind of be able to capture some smaller fires that might be notable as well. And so folks, I believe, are unmuted if anyone wants to jump in here and have questions or comments at this point.
Right. This is Melissa. I just want to test something. Given the dashboard I'm seeing, can someone on the phone who's just calling in give a shout out and indicate that you can be heard?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, who is this?
Rob Griffith.
Okay. Can we get someone on the phone, Chuck or Greg, to indicate that we can hear you? Okay. I might need to see about that. I'm going to try to send out an unmute code for those on the phone. For Chuck, it is, oh, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes. And then
this is Chuck.
Okay, great. And Greg, your PIN is 76. So if you want to enable muting or unmuting, I think you hit pound 76 pound. Okay, hopefully everybody that wants to chime in is able to now. Thank you. Sorry for that interruption. So we were leaving off at, is there anything anyone wants to say off the bat about any particular fire?
And I'll just add to sort of the we'll go over these individually as well. So if things come up and ideas that come to mind that you want to share, there'll be opportunities as well a little bit further on. So I'm going to take that as good to go forward. And so we know in Hawaii, for in terms of climate and weather, that drought is a big factor, as it is in most places. And we've got a couple resources. So the U.S. Drought Monitor is updated weekly by Kevin Kodama with the National Weather Service, works on that. And then we also have the National Weather Service out updating this daily Keach-Byram Drought Index. So the difference between these two is the U.S. Drought Monitor is sort of spatially explicit, so it kind of shows areas of drought on the map, whereas the Keach-Byram Drought Index, or KBDI, is derived from Honolulu Airport. So it's daily, but it's really sort of limited in space. We also know, though, looking at these kind of resources, that 75% of all historical fires that we have data for actually occur in a drought category. So from drought D0, which is abnormally dry or worse, which is a pretty good indicator for when conditions are sort of prone to having fires occur. And for larger fires, fires over 100 acres, that percentage actually jumps up to 85%. So these can be pretty good indicators of fire weather. And now looking at this figure that Melissa helped me with, you can see the extent. So on the right-hand side is the percent of land area under these given drought categories. And then the left-hand side is acres burned. So you can kind of just see this timeline of fire when they've occurred and relative to drought conditions. And so you can kind of see that we had a couple peaks in these sort of lower intensity droughts through April and May. It got wet in the early summer, and then towards the end of the year, August into September, as when the large proportion of the state entered drought again and hit these sort of more intense categories. And we had a sort of string of these fires towards the end of the year in October, November. We also know, are starting to understand about relative humidity and wind speed. Again, these are sort of typical fire weather indicators. We have less, I would say, less understanding of what these sort of fire weather thresholds are for Hawaii, but this top panel with the gray and yellow bars is showing you kind of how the spread of conditions looked like for temperature, relative humidity, and maximum wind speed. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but and we don't worry so much about temperature because it's so constant over the course of the year, but we have red flag thresholds. This is thresholds under which the National Weather Service issues red flag warnings for sort of dangerous fire conditions. At about 45% humidity and about when the wind speed is 20 miles per hour or greater for 2 hours or more. And so we have these thresholds, and you kind of see how they line up sort of right around the 90th percentile, 95th percentile for relative humidity. And then that panel below kind of shows, you're looking at a 10-year average is like the sort of the first dot in all these panels, and then looking at all fires versus fires greater than 100 acres. You can see there's not much of a signal there for temperature, but for humidity, you can see that all the fires, and especially large fires, definitely occur under these drier conditions. And then wind speed seems to be a pretty important factor for these larger fires, fires over 100 acres. And then that map on the right-hand side there just kind of shows, where these conditions are most frequent in the state. So we can actually look at the number of days in which these areas in the state exceed red flag thresholds. And so in some of these parts of the Big Island, for example, up towards Kauai High and Waimea, you're looking at 100 days per year when you're sort of falling in these conditions. So they can be quite frequent in some parts of the state. And all this really say is when we try to look at the patterns for these fires. So what I did is actually look at the nearest weather station, and sometimes there's weather stations pretty close, other times there are not, just to kind of see how the conditions stacked up during the fire relative to sort of average conditions. So if you see this red line, what that's highlighting is the maximum wind speed at the time of the fire. And so if you kind of just run down, and I apologize, I hate showing tables or having to look at these tables like this on PowerPoints, but I didn't really see another way to do this, but if you look at those, kind of run down that list, you can see that the maximum wind speeds recorded during these fires were quite a bit higher than the average maximum wind speed. These would be average daily wind, max daily wind speeds. And so on average, 22 miles an hour versus 10. So definitely wind was a factor in the majority of these fires. And then same kind of patterns for relative humidity. We had some pretty big, significant drops in humidity once these fires happen. So you can see, for example, these Waimea fires. One was Waimea Kauai, and the other large ones, Waimea on the Big Island. So down into the 40s for a number of these fires. And so again, your average minimum relative humidity for these locations is about 64%. And during these fires, there was an average of 49%. So again, we can kind of see that these thresholds make sense for us, and they actually do kind of tell us when fires are most likely to happen. And just to give you guys some resources here, the National Weather Service has this Hawaiian fire weather products page that you can look up, and they give the KBVI, or the drought, that daily drought index, and you can request spot forecasts for those in fire response. I think everyone's pretty familiar with that. And then we hosted a webinar by Derek Rowe from National Weather Service on fire weather in the Pacific Islands. So that's available on the Pacific Fire Exchange website if you want some background and more information about that. And so the fires that I'm reporting today were actually mapped using satellite imagery, and so we were able to get greater detail than some of the basics that you get from incident reports by tracking these things down. And the way this works, it's fairly simple, but it takes a little bit of coding know-how. But there's this really cool tool called Google Earth Engine. And what it does is just give you instant access to all of the satellite that's freely available satellite imagery from European Space Agency, from the United States government, so Landsat and Sentinel, MODIS, anything you want is pretty much on these Google servers. You can whip it up as soon as it's taken, essentially. And so the idea was we got satellite imagery of each fire, map the perimeters, so you can kind of play around with how they show. So this is kind of looking these infrared bands to make that fire scar pop. Just draw a perimeter around it, and then you can export that. And then what we use is I actually overlaid these fires onto the Hawaii gap analysis land cover product. And this just allows us to say, okay, within that perimeter, what vegetation types or fuel types actually burned. And so this is just showing an example, and to give you some context, between 2002 to 2011, you can see of all that area burned, 14% occurs in forests. So forests constitute a relatively small proportion of the area burned, and a much larger proportion is happening in these shrublands and grasslands. So 86% of the area burned over that decade, and most of these grasslands are non-native, and I'd say about a third of those shrublands are non-native shrublands. And this is how it looked for this year. So this is just summarizing all of the fires, this past year, in 2017. You can see same kind of patterns. About 4,000 of that 7,000 acres or so occurred in alien grassland. Another 1,500 acres in alien shrublands. A small proportion in native shrubland, and then 400 acres of alien forest. So this year we did all right in terms of there was no native forest, at least according to the high gap, that was affected by these fires. And then I thought it'd be interesting to kind of break down this other category. And the pattern that kind of emerges there is that, again, this high gap product, it's being revised sort of periodically over time, but it really goes back to about 2005 or so. So the majority of that 1,000 acres, 1,100 acres in other categories is classified as cultivated agriculture. But when you break that cultivated agriculture down, so this is that top little pie chart on the right, and if you look at the little pie chart below that, actually what we see is most of that's classified as cultivated agriculture is in these areas like Central Maui, Waimea Kauai, and Kahului Maui as well, which are actually all abandoned at this point. So they're pretty much would fall into this alien grassland category. But it sort of paints the picture of one of the biggest challenges we have in Hawaii is as these plantation lands are going out of production, it can significantly increase the amount of area that's prone to fires. And then this is kind of where I thought I'd break it down. And I kind of want to apologize a little bit because I didn't really see any other way but sort of going through this one at a time. So I'd encourage folks, if they have questions about these specific incidents, to chime in here. And I just tried to group these fires sort of arbitrarily, but kind of look at the big ones first, and kind of then go through in order that they occurred the past year. So Pohakaloa, this was a fire that was all at Pohakaloa training area, but sort of down the slope towards Waikiki. So you can kind of see in the upper right hand corner of that map, that's Waikiki Ranch. So it's kind of getting near to the to the ranch lands there, but the Fed Fire guys, Chief Eric Moeller up there, they were able to contain it without really threatening many of the resources there. Another sort of larger one for last year happened in Waimea, Kauai. So this area has burned repeatedly in the past. And again, these are all old sugar lands that kind of sit up there above Waimea. And we've seen large fires in the same area kind of again and again. There's also another fire you can see sort of on the right-hand side. There was a 30-acre fire that was on Robinson land over there. And then it takes us, the biggest fire that we got this year, or last year rather, was in Waimea. And so I have another category kind of about WUI fires, but this one is right on the edge of the community in Waimea. It was quite large, 2,200 acres. And you can see the breakdown is almost all alien grassland that burns. So these are areas that are kind of prone and sort of infamous and for fire activity here in Hawaii. And then the Waikapuna fire happened in September down below, kind of south of Naalehu there. And you can see also sort of contained along the coast, but that one burned for about a week or so. And again, definitely impact a little bit more forest cover. So almost 200 acres of alien forest. So that would be kind of more Kiave and dry scrub forest, in addition to shrublands and grasslands in that area. And so I think on the right-hand side is ranch lands of that fire. And the next sort of set of fires I classified because they sort of came right up to the edge of communities. So again, wildland-urban interface fires, although I would add that kind of any of those larger fires could be classified in the same way. So one of the earlier fires in the year in February burned right outside Naalehu. So you can kind of see this wind-driven fire. It started from the right-hand side and was kind of spreading right towards that community. Burned about 150 acres, mostly grassland and shrubland. There was another one quite small, so only 38 acres, but right on the edge of Cocoa Head, kind of the eastern side of that, on Oahu. So again, kind of right near some homes and infrastructure there. There's another one on Oahu, which was interesting. So in Hawaii Kai, Kamilo Nui Valley, and this was a string of multiple fires that happened. So they had some issues with arson up in the backside of this valley, and the biggest one that broke out was about 65 acres. But even in this image, you can kind of pick out some of these smaller burn scars that are there from previous fires. And then kind of moving along onto Maui in the summertime, about in July, we had a 175-acre fire right outside Kahului. So again, kind of raising this issue of abandoned agricultural lands. Similarly in Kunia, so this image is a little bit harder to pick up, but you can kind of see under the cloud cover there. It's also gives you a sense of some of the challenges from mapping fires this way, because we have to wait till these cloud-free days. But again, another fire that burned right up to the edge of the community. You can see on the lower side, southern edge of that fire. And in Pahala, there was another fire. This one was kind of challenging to pull out because it consisted of more forest cover. So about 60 acres or so of forest cover in that fire. And again, it's kind of on the edge of the community there, not right directly adjacent to it, but and then some of these other fires that were more restricted to ag and kind of the edge of forest land. So we had about 377 acres on Wailua, so up on the north shore of Oahu, and this one was pretty challenging. You can kind of see within that red circle how intricate the perimeter is on this fire. challenging to map, but it gives you a sense of how challenging it was to respond, just given the terrain there. 200-acre fire happened in September at Poipu, and again, one that was kind of right near community down there, but it was mostly restricted to grasslands. It stopped on the northern edge there at some of the active agricultural lands, and it kind of petered into this non-native forest on the west side. And then these kind of grouped together, but there were 3 separate ignition points at least, but all happened pretty much in succession. In central Maui, we had these fires that have burned a total of about 470 acres. Again, abandoned ag lands. So we're seeing this pattern emerge again. Most of our fires are happening in these non-native grasslands, and as ag kind of goes out across the state, this is definitely increasing the burden placed on the fire responders in this area. And that's about it. The one fire that I know of that I haven't mapped or wasn't able to, just given the forest cover there, was there was also a 50-acre fire in Haena, basically the same day or day after that Poipu fire. But at this point, the idea was to turn it over to you guys, stop myself from talking for a little bit. But if you guys have comments or lessons learned about any of these incidents, you know, I can back up and check them out. And we really want to put this together, but realize, you know, our ability to what we can kind of quantify and assess is quite limited, because we're not able to be there, you know, and talking to folks after every incident. So if there's any questions, we can either jump on and you can write them in through the chat box, or we can get you to, you know, unmute you on the phones, and you can just either chime in or ask questions.
Yeah, this is Melissa. Thank you, Clay, for that setup. I just want to also let people know that if there were fires outside of those that Clay covered today, you're welcome to discuss them as well. So we don't have to limit ourselves to the larger ones necessarily. And also, I hope that everybody at this point is unmuted. I'm doing my best on the technology end to make sure we can hear everyone. And if you're online and you can't be heard, you can send us a chat or a question or raise your hand. And once again, I think the one person on the phone who might not be unmuted is Greg Funderburk. Your audio PIN number is 76, so you just hit pound 76 pound to enable muting or unmuting. All right, thank you. Group, take it away.
Okay, there's a question here. What is, Melissa, did you just ask me this question? Or is this from somebody else?
I did not send in any questions.
Oh, so someone had a question, but it's actually attributing it to Melissa. But someone is asking on the chat window, do you have any idea of how many of these fires are arson, deliberately set versus accidental? You know, camping or back to truck into the dry grass. This would probably be a question for the responders. We don't have that information to share at this hand, aside from some anecdotal accounts of what sort of people's hunches were for a few of these fires. And some of the patterns, what some of the patterns might indicate. For example, that string of 3 fires in Maui was definitely suspicious, for example. And I know from talking with DOFA folks that, for example, the fire that burned sort of up into the forest in Wailua on Oahu was due to a truck being parked in the grass. But this comes up a lot, and I think folks are, especially on the fire agencies, I don't want to speak for them, but sense is that it's difficult to get enough resources to put into these kinds of investigations. So often these fires aren't attributed to a specific cause. Any other thoughts or questions? I know that Greg had contacted us saying he had stuff to share. I don't know if you can chime in or if you're able to speak. Greg Funderbuck from the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Oh, that was JB. Thanks, JB. who asked that last question about ignition sources. And it's crickets. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so Greg says he's unable to use his audio, but he can quickly write his comments.
Oh, great.
So go ahead, Greg. While you're entering your comments, Greg, we have from Rob Griffith. Were there existing fuel breaks that the fires run into to slow or stop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, most of the times that you're seeing these like sort of straight lines along there would have been either roads that they were defending off of. So I think Waikapuna fire, if I back up, that's not it. You can kind of see some of the lines. But also sort of like this sort of west edge, I believe, was a fire break that they were using dozers to construct to contain the fire. And so you can kind of see that straight line on the west side of this, and then where it's sort of broken out in a couple spots from there. But that's kind of one of the questions we were hoping to gain from some of the responders who might have been on these fires. Some of the other agricultural areas you can kind of see as well where they were, so the Kahului fire, for example, where it's kind of abutting against along the edge of some of these parcels where some of these older cane roads are situated. But again, one of the big concerns that comes up again with discussion with fire responders is that, you know, now that these agricultural areas are no longer being maintained, the roads aren't either. So it is, it's yes and no. There are fire breaks out there on roads that serve as anchor points for response, but the condition sort of varies based on how well maintained these areas are. Excuse me.
Okay, we have Greg's comment in. I'm going to read out what he wrote. Thank you, Greg. We have the National Park Service was lucky not to be on the large fire list. We had a 3-acre fire with potential that we successfully suppressed due to fixed tanks that the park had installed in a high-risk area. The area had a history of human ignition, no natural water sources, no county water, located in dry ohia woodland with invasive grasses. High values at risk included subdivision, highway corridor, and rare plants. 2 15,000-gallon tanks were installed in 2000. Thank you for those comments, Greg. Over the line, I can hear some movement and potential lunch enjoyment. If you could.
Greg, sorry, Melissa. Greg added that they were those tanks were used by a county helicopter, and they were able to get to the fire, respond to the fire in less than 30 minutes to keep it at 3 acres.
Are there any other folks on the line who would like to speak to their experiences with the 2017 fires, whether it was interesting observations or lessons learned?
Greg adds that the National Park Service monitors KBDI at several of their locations. Yeah, KBDI seems to be kind of the preferred drought index for these islands where we kind of get pretty quick changes in drought condition, and also I think given the sensitivity of some of these grasslands, in other words, how rapidly these grass fuels respond to those changes, that daily drought indices would seem to be appropriate. versus so on the mainland, for example, Palmer drought severity. There are other indices that people use to indicate fire risk. And I've talked with Derek Rowe with the National Weather Service. Just as an aside here, we kind of talked about the decision to use the Honolulu airport kind of as the main indicator for their.
That's the one. Ross Baker said something about OU.
And it's not ideal that it's a fixed location, but what he was able to do is actually kind of monitor KBDI there and compare it to some of the leeward areas, so some of the drier areas in the state. And so what he found was that they lined up pretty well with the KBDI estimates at the Honolulu airport, which is why they use that. And again, in the fire weather section too, it's one of those things where I think in terms of fire response, folks are highly aware, keenly aware, and monitoring those conditions in real time. But when it comes to kind of land management, it's a difficult thing to be able to sort of respond and change your behavior according to the weather conditions, aside from maybe restricting access or restricting use of machinery, things like that, sort of higher risk activities. But it's one of these things where we've been trying to figure out how important or how useful those kinds of information products are for folks who are kind of more on the managing vegetation and land versus like active fire responders. Okay, here's another. Okay, so can you plot drought index or some other index of rainfall moisture for a given area versus when the fire occurs? Yeah, so that's when it comes back. The data that I've been looking at is looking at more of the spatial products. So that is Drought Monitor, for example. And then we've been working with the University of Hawaii Geography Department. So they've got this long-term rainfall history to develop some drought indices from that data. The problem and why I sort of prefer the KBI and the Drought Monitor is that it's available in real time. So it's updated. For example, the Drought Monitor is updated weekly, KBDI daily. And so some of those other rainfall products, they're available till about 2015. So they're not that useful as far as indicating fire danger in real time. Even though they may be really good at indicating when fire risk is high, looking at these historical fires, it's not as useful as these other products that are updated regularly. Any other questions? And I would just like to say we're just trying this out. The thought was that we would maybe try to encourage some input and get a better sense for like lessons learned potentially at some of these areas, realizing that that kind of discussion and knowledge really sits with the fire responders, and so and we just see it as incredibly valuable. So we just figured we'd give it a shot, put this webinar together and see what kind of input we could get. So thank you guys, Greg especially for chiming in. And if other people have thoughts that sort of occur to them afterwards, again, we're trying to kind of put this together into a written format just to be able to characterize the situation for last year and kind of keep tabs on how things are changing and what resources are being put at risk year to year. It's never been done for Hawaii, and so we're just taking a stab at it. So I appreciate mostly everyone showing interest and signing up for the webinar today.
I'd like to jump in, Clay, and I'm going to start calling people out. I'm going to start calling.
From Maui Fire, from Lionel. I see you on the no comment. Just wanted to say thanks. Oh, thanks. Thank you for chiming in, Lionel.
I'm curious, for example, with the, let's just take the Oahu fires of last year. Is there anyone on the line from Honolulu or from Oahu Dofa that has any observations or lessons learned from those fires? Does anyone have questions about those fires more specifically for the responders or the people who might have been in the area?
Again, I'm just like speaking from my chats and conversations with people after these fires. I know the Oahu fire, the Wailua fire, for example, that I just popped back up on the screen. They had a water tank truck down there, a water tender from a private landowner. They said was an incredible help. It was basically running water up to the trucks, to their trucks. And again, it sort of points to the problems that I think that a lot of the agencies are running into across the state as land is no longer being used. Not only are the fuels changing, but their access to support from landowners is reduced, and that can play a huge role in their efforts to respond to these fires. Ryan was not on island during both fires on Oahu. Well, thanks for jumping in, Ryan. I appreciate the just letting in anyway. Crazy drum fire. Which was the crazy drum fire? Ryan is saying I was here for the crazy drum fire. Unattended campfire. Oh, right, Kualkaloa. So that Kualkaloa.
Ryan, you should be unmuted. You could probably speak to the group.
Don't want to be unmuted, no problem. But thanks for sharing. Was that that fire? Do you remember when that one happened? Because I can go try to include it in the sets of fires that we have here. Well, it lies kind of west, kind of the northwest end of Oahu. And Ryan does not want to be unmuted for the record. Thanks for chiming in. May 10th. Okay, we'll check it out.
Yeah. I remember that.
Wahila crazy drum fire was started by angry homeless people above Manoa. That was Ryan's comment. Wasn't that was 2015, wasn't it? Crazy drum fire, that Wahila fire? The Wahila Ridge is above UH Manoa.
He's just
Probably about 50 acres or so. Well, I guess one question too to think for people is like if you guys are interested in kind of getting your hands on this information put together in sort of a written report, and maybe who else we should be sharing this with in terms of either agency superiors or county councils, things like that. We just kind of want to, again, try to keep fire on folks' radar. Because I think it varies so much year to year. Then we get these sort of quiet years. People tend to think that it's not an issue, and then all of a sudden folks are kind of less prepared for when we do get drier, more active fire years.
Clay, this is Susan. Did you see my question?
No, where is it?
It's up there mixed with Ryan's. I basically was wondering if you have sort of some positive news about when communities get funded through WUI, what is the impact, and can you show that with your data?
Right. That's a great question. So I think the position at now where most communities are at, there are several communities on the Big Island that have been working with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization for a number of years and have put in fire breaks. So Waikoloa Village is an example. But most of the communities that have sort of has that efforts expanded through Firewise, they're not quite, I would say, not quite at the state where they're putting in large mitigation projects quite yet. So it's have to be opportunistic as far as looking at where these fires have kind of come up and adjacent to communities, and whether or not there's been some action taken by those communities to say, you know, and the best example actually is from that 2005. There was a 25,000 acre fire that burnt down towards Waikoloa Village, and Hawaii Wildfire had just helped that community establish a fire break. I think they finished, you know, within weeks before that fire, and it provided defensible space for them. So yeah, I think it would be a matter of kind of going incident to incident and trying to line it up with the efforts that Hawaii Wildfire has been supporting on the community side.
Yeah, I think that would be really valuable, and really, you know, people like to hear success stories, and if you just always have doom and gloom, you know, but if you're showing that if you do X and you get Y, then it's worth the money of investing.
Yeah,
that would be a great part of the annual review.
That's an excellent idea. I mean, putting in just what folks are doing, and that's so funny that you say that, because it's something that like I gripe about all the time, and then I'm falling victim to it. But you know, that idea that we're trying to pitch stories, especially to the news media. So that whole we did the wildfire and drought lookout campaign with DLNR and all the county fire departments, and what the idea that the public relations folks with DLNR, Dan Dennison, had, which was great, was try to pitch these good news stories so that you could get the news, the media, to cover mitigation efforts. So the example that was pitched, for example, was Ryan Peralta, who's on the phone, his work at Hawaiian Lake High, you know, working on this vegetated fuel breaks there, for example. And it's a challenge getting them to kind of bite, to tell those stories. They just usually report on fires when the mountain's burning up, unfortunately.
Right.
But yeah, thanks for the input. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and just to follow up on your last comment, I did send this out pretty far and wide across at least, you know, our Forest Service people, and people seemed really interested and asked if they could pass it on. I don't see a lot of participation, but I think if something becomes sort of an annual event, then I think it'll grow organically for sure.
Cool. Yeah, well, we look forward to it. And again, we're just sort of trying this out as far as the webinar format. I know we're all kind of challenged because we want to do it statewide, but we're all in different islands. So I appreciate everyone's patience and for trying this out. Is there any other questions or comments? I'm just kind of scrolling through there that I'm just make sure I didn't miss anyone else's. Okay, here we go.
Hey, Clay, Clay,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hey, Clay, this is Chuck on Maui. I was just curious if your data sets include Kaho'olawe, Lanai, and Molokai, and if they were just fortunate enough to not have any large fires in 2017.
Yeah, so I track the fires that I hear about, you know, either from talking with responders, the news and all that. So there might have been small fires, but there were no larger ones. So I'm tracking wherever they're occurring, basically. And I would say that this is the first year that I've been able to kind of pull it all together. I've got sort of these scattered records for the years between, I would say from sort of 2012 until 2016. And right now I'm kind of getting a student on board to kind of backtrack through those as well. But we just thought we had this opportunity and just to kind of put a fire under my butt to actually put it all together in a way that we can talk about it. So yeah, it's statewide. So, and sometimes you even pick up fires from satellite. On Niihau, there's some records there as well, but we of course don't really find any information from that. But there are multiple ways to sort of track these incidents. And a lot of it, on my end, is just sort of just playing with satellite images. So it's a little, a couple steps removed, but I think it provides useful information. And so there's a question here on the chat. John Scanlon, is the fire data displayed on here gathered from NIFRS, so from the National Fire Incident Reporting System? Yes and no. So Mike Walker, who's the new fire protection forester for the state, Hawaii, shared the 2017 NIFRS data with me to sort of compare it. I can scroll back to that slide. What tends to happen on some of these other, for these other years that that's at least been shared with me, is that we're missing records. So from the county. And I know in years past, Wayne Ching, who was the sort of Mike's predecessor at DOFA, was there for years, would actually go and collect this data from the county agencies to include it. And he sort of stopped doing that towards, I think, the last few years of his career. But we have been working with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization to just get the records directly from the county agencies and states so that we can kind of put them all together. And right now we actually tried to get an update. We have up to about 2012, and we actually been in contact with all the agencies to get updates. We just didn't pool the data. We didn't get it together from all the agencies in time to present it all. But that's an issue. It's sort of like we never really gone through systematically and reconciled how well the NIFRS data reflects the agency records. Because I just don't know at the county level. This would be, again, for the responders to chime in if every fire is reported or they're just reporting larger fires, for example. So for 2017, there was a whole bunch of county fires listed, but I don't know that that is all of the fires. And again, as elsewhere, like the vast majority of these fires in Hawaii are very small. So we look at these really big numbers of ignitions. In fact, the ignition densities that we see in Hawaii are off the charts compared to data I can find from anywhere else. But it's just these few fires that account for most of the acres burned for any given year. How are we for time? We're almost at 2 o'clock. We have about 4 more minutes if anyone has questions or comments, ideas. All right, well, Melissa, do you want to call anyone out, or maybe we'll sign off?
Yeah, well, one thing I would like to request of the group is when you leave the webinar, there will be a survey popped up, and we'd appreciate it if you could take just a few minutes to fill it out. And actually, probably of greatest interest to us are the last 3 questions that are short answers of what you liked, what you would change, and how we can make it better. And as Clay mentioned, this is the first time we're doing this, and we're feeling it out. We want, our goal is to be useful to everyone involved in wildfire management and response in Hawaii and the Pacific. So please let us know how we can do better and what you like.
Yeah, and before everyone signs off, I forgot I had one more slide here, just about upcoming events. And then really the big upcoming event that I wanted to plug here is 2017 Hawaii Wildfire Summit. It's really being organized by Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization in partnership with Big Fire Exchange, as well as the Big Island Wildfire Coordinating Group. So that's happening May 2 to 4, May 2nd to the 4th at Mauna Lani Resort on the Big Island. And you can find details. I know registration is open now, so go check it out. There's also a whole number of trainings I think happening prior to it and during. So I think it's going to be pretty cool. And then just wanted to give a plug for some of the related research and publications sections for the PFX website, where you can find webinars on fire weather. That we did one recently on land cover maps. You can kind of see some of the data we used in this presentation, and some other things, fuels and wildfire behavior training module, and a pre-fire planning guide. And then, yeah, the plug that Melissa already reminded you guys that please fill out that survey. It helps us out. So with that, I think we will sign off. And thanks once again to everyone for jumping on today. We really appreciate your participation.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Gala. Yep. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye, thank you. I think so. I think we'll end it now. Stop.